I never thought I'd be sitting in a courthouse hallway, clutching legal papers while my own parents walked out of their lawyer's office wearing smug grins that made my stomach turn. 10 brutal years of saving every single penny, working double shifts at the auto plant, living off ramen noodles in a cramped studio apartment. All for this moment when I could finally buy my dream home with cold hard cash. $154,000 for a brand new 2024 Clayton, double-wide mobile home paid in full. Now they're suing me, claiming I stole their inheritance money that was never even theirs to begin with. My name is Brewster, and this nightmare began 3 months ago. But the real story starts 10 years back when my grandmother Martha was dying in that sterile hospital room in Lansing, Michigan. She was the only person who ever truly loved me. While my parents, Dale and Patricia, were off chasing their next get-rich-quick scheme, or blowing their paychecks at the casino, Grandma Martha raised me from the time I was 7 years old. I remember her papery hand gripping mine as she whispered those final words that would shape the next decade of my life. Brewster, honey, everything I have saved up in that old coffee can under my bedroom floorboards is for you. Build yourself a real home someday, not like these apartment complexes and rental trailers. Something permanent that nobody can ever take away from you. She passed away that Tuesday morning in October, and I made a promise at her graveside that I would honor her wish. The coffee can held $48,000 in crumpled bills and rolled coins. It wasn't much, but it was a start. What followed were the most grueling 10 years of my life. I took a job at the Ford assembly plant in Dearborn, working the night shift, because it paid an extra $2 per hour. Every morning when my shift ended, I'd drive straight to whatever landscaping job I could find, mowing lawns and trimming hedges until the sun went down. Weekends meant heading to the plasma donation center twice a week, letting them stick needles in my arms for $45 a pop. I lived in a 300-square-foot studio apartment that smelled like cigarettes from the previous tenant. My furniture consisted of a mattress on the floor, a folding card table, and a plastic lawn chair I'd found by a dumpster. My meals were 99-cent ramen noodles, peanut butter sandwiches, and whatever expired food the grocery store was throwing away. Every dollar that didn't go to rent or keeping my beat-up Honda Civic running went straight into my savings account. My parents thought I'd lost my mind. They'd show up at my apartment unannounced, shaking their heads at my living conditions. "You're wasting your life, Brewster," my father would say, cracking open one of my few beers without asking. "Live a little. You can't take money with you when you die." But I had a vision. I'd spent hours researching manufactured homes online, studying floor plans, and imagining the day I could afford something decent. The 2024 Clayton Delight series caught my eye with its spacious layout, modern appliances, and quality construction. The double-wide models started at $140,000, not including the land. Finding the right piece of property took another year. I wanted something in Tennessee, away from Michigan's harsh winters and my parents' constant interference. The lot I eventually found was perfect, 3 acres of gently rolling hills, overlooking a small lake, surrounded by oak trees that had probably been standing since before the Civil War. The seller was an elderly farmer named Buck, who was moving to assisted living. He sold me the land for $26,000, because, as he put it, I reminded him of his grandson who died in Afghanistan. The day I wrote that cashier's check for $154,000 was the proudest moment of my life. I'd paid in full for both the manufactured home and the land. No mortgage, no monthly payments, no debt of any kind. Just pure ownership of something beautiful that was mine alone. The Clayton home was everything I dreamed of. 1,200 square feet of open floor plan with vaulted ceilings, stainless steel appliances, hardwood laminate flooring, and windows that let in natural light from every direction. I spent my first month there, just walking from room to room, touching the walls and reminding myself that this was real. For 3 blissful months, I lived the life my grandmother had wanted for me. I found work at a local auto parts store, made friends with my neighbors, and started a small vegetable garden behind the house. Every morning I'd sit on my front deck, with coffee watching the sun rise over the lake, and thinking about how proud Grandma Martha would be. Then my parents showed up. I was replacing a broken fence post when their rusted pickup truck pulled into my driveway. Dale climbed out first, his beer gut, straining against a faded NASCAR t-shirt, followed by Patricia in her usual uniform of leopard print leggings and oversized sunglasses. Behind them emerged a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. "Brewster," my father called out, "we need to talk. This here's Harold Grimsby, our lawyer." Harold Grimsby looked like a used car salesman who'd been dipped in hair gel and squeezed into a suit 2 sizes too small. His smile revealed teeth so white they had to be fake, and his handshake felt like grabbing a dead fish. "Son," Dale continued, "we've got some bad news about this house situation. Turns out that money you used wasn't actually yours to spend." My heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" Patricia stepped forward, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Honey, your grandmother's will clearly states that her estate was supposed to be divided equally between all her children. That includes your father. You essentially stole our inheritance." Grimsby opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "I'm afraid your parents are correct, young man. According to these estate documents, Martha Wilson's assets were to be distributed equally among her 3 surviving children: Dale, his sister Margaret, and his brother Robert. The cash you discovered should have been part of that distribution." I stared at the papers, my vision blurring as I tried to process what I was seeing. There was my grandmother's signature at the bottom, dated just 2 weeks before she died. But something felt wrong. The handwriting looked shaky, uncertain, nothing like the firm script I remembered from her birthday cards and letters. "This is impossible," I said, my voice cracking. "She told me specifically that money was for me. She wanted me to have a home." "Alzheimer's is a terrible thing," Patricia said, not bothering to hide the satisfaction in her voice. "Poor woman, probably didn't even remember making those promises by the end." But I knew that was a lie. My grandmother's mind had been sharp as a tack right up until her final breath. She'd been doing crossword puzzles and reading mystery novels the week before she died. There was no way she'd have signed anything giving away the money she'd promised to me. Grimsby cleared his throat. "We're prepared to be reasonable about this matter. You can either agree to sell this property and divide the proceeds equally among the rightful heirs, or we'll be forced to take legal action. The choice is yours." I looked at my parents, searching their faces for any hint of the people who'd raised me. All I saw was greed and entitlement, the same expression they'd worn every time they'd asked to borrow money they'd never pay back. "Get off my property," I said quietly. Now Brewster Dale started, "Don't be stupid about this. We're family. Family doesn't steal from each other." I shot back my anger, finally breaking through the shock. "And family sure as hell doesn't forge legal documents." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Grimsby's plastic smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "I understand you're upset, son. These situations are never easy. But fighting this in court will only cost you more money in the long run. We're offering you a chance to walk away with something, rather than lose everything." After they left, I sat on my front steps and cried for the first time since my grandmother's funeral. The legal papers they'd served me were real enough, demanding that I vacate the property within 30 days and pay damages for unlawful occupation of what they claimed was rightfully theirs. But as I looked at those documents more carefully, one detail kept nagging at me. The signature on my grandmother's will was dated March 15th. I remembered that date clearly because it was the day she'd had her final stroke and lost consciousness. She'd been in the hospital sedated and unresponsive when this will was supposedly signed. Someone had forged my grandmother's signature, and I had a pretty good idea who. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse in Cookeville and filed a response to my parents' lawsuit, using nearly every dollar I had left to hire an attorney. Sarah Blackwood was a solo practitioner who specialized in estate disputes, and she agreed to take my case after reviewing the suspicious will. "This signature definitely looks questionable," she said, examining the document through a magnifying glass. The pressure and stroke patterns are inconsistent with the other signatures we have on file for your grandmother. I think we should hire a handwriting expert. While Sarah worked on the legal aspects, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I drove back to Michigan and spent a week digging into my parents' recent activities. What I discovered made my blood run cold. My father had racked up over $60,000 in gambling debts at the Cherokee Casino in North Carolina. The loan sharks he'd borrowed from weren't the type to accept late payments. Meanwhile, my mother had been taking cash advances on every credit card she could qualify for, using the money to buy lottery tickets and scratch-offs in some delusional belief that she could win back what Dale had lost. They were drowning in debt, and my mobile home represented their only lifeline. I decided to search my grandmother's old farmhouse, which had been sitting empty since her death. The key was still hidden under the ceramic frog by the back door, just like always. Walking through those rooms felt like stepping back in time. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Her reading glasses on the kitchen table, a half-finished crossword puzzle, the smell of lavender sachets in her bedroom closet. I spent hours going through her papers, looking for any evidence that might contradict the forged will. Most of it was routine stuff: utility bills, church bulletins, letters from distant relatives. But something made me pull out her old King James Bible, the one she'd read from every morning for as long as I could remember. The binding felt thicker than usual, and when I examined it closely, I could see where someone had carefully sewn extra material into the cover. My grandmother had been an excellent seamstress, and this looked like her handiwork. Using a small knife from her kitchen, I carefully opened the seam. Inside was a folded piece of paper in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. It was her real will, dated 3 months before she died, when her mind was completely clear. In it, she left everything to me, along with a note explaining that she'd hidden this document because she didn't trust my father to respect her wishes. Brewster. The note read, "If you're reading this, it means someone has tried to steal what I'm leaving you. Your father has always been weak when it comes to money and gambling. I pray this never happens, but if it does, know that every word in this will is the truth. The money under my floorboards is yours alone. Build that home we talked about, and remember that real family means protecting each other, not taking advantage." I held that paper in my shaking hands and felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. This was proof that my grandmother's true intentions had been to leave everything to me. But when I confronted my parents at their double-wide trailer in the Pine Valley Mobile Home Park, they weren't impressed by my discovery. "That's obviously a fake," Patricia said, barely glancing at the will. "Probably something you cooked up when you realized you were caught red-handed." Dale was more direct. "Even if that's real, it doesn't matter now. We've already used your house as collateral to get a loan from a private investor. If we don't pay him back, he gets the property anyway." My heart sank. "What kind of loan?" $50,000 at 20% interest, he said, avoiding my eyes. "We needed the money to pay off some people who were getting impatient about what we owed them." "You mortgaged my house without my permission. How is that even legal?" Patricia's voice turned sharp and defensive. "It's not your house, Brewster. It never was. That money belonged to the family, and you stole it. We had every right to use the property to secure a loan. Besides," Dale added, "Harold says you manipulated a sick old woman into changing her will. That's elder abuse, son. You could go to prison for that." I stared at these people who shared my blood and felt nothing but disgust. They'd taken the one good thing in my life, the dream my grandmother had died believing in, and turned it into collateral for their gambling debts. When I got back to Tennessee, I found Harold Grimsby waiting in my driveway with more legal documents. This time, he had a court order requiring me to allow a property inspection and appraisal. "Just a formality," he said with that same oily smile. "We need to establish the current value for the lawsuit. I'm sure you understand." The appraiser he brought was a nervous man who kept glancing at Grimsby as he worked. When he finished, he handed me a copy of his report. According to his assessment, my 3 acres of prime lakefront property was worth only $45,000. I knew that was impossible. Similar lots in the area were selling for at least $100,000, and some of the larger parcels were going for much more. That evening, Sarah Blackwood called with devastating news. "I've submitted your grandmother's handwritten will to the court, but Grimsby has filed a motion claiming it's fabricated evidence. He's demanding a full forensic analysis, which could take months. In the meantime, he's asking the judge to freeze all assets related to the estate." What does that mean? It means you can't sell the property or use it as collateral for anything until this case is resolved. And if the forensic analysis doesn't conclusively prove the handwritten will is authentic, we could lose everything. I hung up the phone and walked out to my deck, staring at the lake in the moonlight. 3 months ago, this place had felt like paradise. Now it felt like a prison, and the walls were closing in fast. My parents had managed to turn my grandmother's final gift into a weapon against me, and I was running out of options to fight back. Somewhere out there, whoever had lent them $50,000 was waiting to collect. And if my parents couldn't pay, they'd be coming for my home next. The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late September. I dressed in the only suit I owned, a navy blue hand-me-down from my grandmother's church clothing drive, and sat in the gallery, watching Harold Grimsby parade a series of witnesses before the judge. The first was a woman named Linda Foster, who claimed to be a former neighbor of my grandmother's. She testified that Martha had been showing signs of dementia for years, often forgetting conversations and becoming confused about money matters. "She used to ask me the same questions over and over," Foster said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "It was heartbreaking to watch such a sharp woman decline like that. Toward the end, she couldn't even remember my name most days." The second witness was a man named Marcus Webb, who said he'd been my grandmother's handyman. According to his testimony, Martha had frequently complained about feeling pressured by family members to change her will. She told me that boy Brewster was always asking about her money. Webb said, pointing at me from the witness stand. She felt guilty about disappointing him, but she knew it wouldn't be fair to cut out her own son just because the kid was more persistent. I wanted to jump up and call them both liars, but Sarah had instructed me to stay quiet and let her handle the cross-examination. Unfortunately, both witnesses had their stories down cold. They answered every question, consistently providing just enough detail to sound believable without contradicting each other. When it was our turn to present evidence, Sarah called me to the stand to testify about my relationship with my grandmother. I told the truth about everything: the bedside promise, the 10 years of saving the coffee can full of money, and my grandmother's sharp mental state right up until her stroke. "My grandmother was doing crossword puzzles the morning she had her stroke," I said, looking directly at the judge. "She was reading a mystery novel and complaining about how predictable the ending was. There was absolutely nothing wrong with her mind." But Grimsby's cross-examination was brutal. He painted me as a greedy grandson who'd taken advantage of an elderly woman's affection, suggesting that I'd manipulated her into hiding money from her rightful heirs. "Isn't it true, Mr. Wilson, that you visited your grandmother more frequently in her final months than you had in previous years?" "Yes, but that's because I knew she was dying. I wanted to spend time with her." "And isn't it true that during these visits you frequently discussed your desire to own a home?" "We talked about a lot of things. She was interested in my dreams and goals, including your goal of convincing her to leave you money that legally belonged to the entire family." "That's not what happened." "But you admit that you knew she had significant cash savings hidden in her house." "She told me about the coffee can, yes." "And you admit that you took this money immediately after her death, without consulting other family members or waiting for proper estate proceedings." I felt the trap closing around me, but there was no way to answer without sounding guilty. I took what she told me was mine. The judge ordered a psychiatric evaluation of my grandmother's mental state at the time of her death, to be conducted by reviewing her medical records. He also ruled that a forensic handwriting analysis would be performed on both wills to determine which one was authentic. This case involves serious questions about elder abuse and the validity of estate documents, Judge Morrison said. I'm ordering both analyses to be completed within 60 days, after which we'll reconvene to hear the results. As I walked out of the courthouse, I felt defeated, but not broken. I still had my grandmother's handwritten will, and I was confident that any legitimate analysis would prove it was authentic. What bothered me was how prepared Grimsby's witnesses had been. Their testimony was too polished, too convenient, and too coordinated to be natural. Over the next few days, I decided to do some investigating. Linda Foster supposedly lived in my grandmother's neighborhood, but when I drove by the address she'd given in court, I found an empty lot with a for sale sign. The real estate agent told me the house had been demolished 6 months ago, and no one named Linda Foster had ever lived there. Marcus Webb's story was even fishier. He claimed to have done handyman work for my grandmother for over 5 years, but I'd never seen him around her house. When I checked with the hardware store where my grandmother always bought her supplies, the owner told me she'd always done her own repairs and had never mentioned hiring help. I was starting to realize that my parents had enlisted fake witnesses to support their case. But proving it would be another matter entirely. My investigation took a disturbing turn when I decided to follow my parents for a few days. I rented a cheap motel room in their town and used my grandmother's old binoculars to watch their trailer from a distance. On the third day, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A black Mercedes pulled up to their trailer, and out stepped a man in an expensive suit who clearly wasn't from around Pine Valley Mobile Home Park. He was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. My parents greeted him like they were old friends, inviting him inside for what looked like a business meeting. After an hour, the man left, but not before shaking hands with both my parents and handing my father a manila envelope. I managed to get close enough to see the license plate on the Mercedes, a personalized plate that read, Kruger 1. That evening, I researched Vincent Kruger online and discovered he was a real estate developer based in Nashville, who specialized in luxury resorts and vacation communities. His company Kruger Development Group had been buying up rural properties all over Tennessee, often using aggressive tactics to force out existing landowners. One article from the Nashville Business Journal caught my attention. It described Kruger's latest project, a $500 million luxury resort planned for the shores of Center Hill Lake, less than 10 miles from my property. The resort would feature a championship golf course marina spa and 200 luxury condominiums. According to the article, Kruger had already acquired most of the land needed for the development, but a few holdout properties were preventing him from breaking ground. The article mentioned that his company was pursuing various legal strategies to acquire the remaining parcels necessary for the project. I stared at my computer screen as the pieces started falling into place. My 3 acres of lakefront property weren't just valuable for their scenic beauty. They were sitting right in the middle of Kruger's planned resort development. If he could acquire my land along with the neighboring properties, he'd have an unobstructed corridor to the lake for his marina and golf course. The fake will, the phony witnesses, the suspiciously low property appraisal, even my parents' sudden interest in claiming their inheritance. It was all part of a scheme to steal my land for a fraction of its true value. But I still didn't understand how my parents fit into this conspiracy, or why Vincent Kruger would bother with such an elaborate plan when he could probably just make me a legitimate offer for the property. The answer came 2 days later, when I followed the black Mercedes to a construction site on the other side of the lake. Kruger was there with a team of surveyors and engineers pointing at maps and discussing what looked like preliminary development plans. I hid behind a cluster of trees and used my grandmother's binoculars to get a better look. What I saw made my heart sink. The entire area around the lake was marked for development. Not just my 3 acres, but dozens of properties belonging to families who'd lived there for generations. Elderly couples in modest homes, young families just starting out, disabled veterans who'd found peace in the quiet rural setting. All of them were unknowingly sitting on land that Kruger wanted for his luxury resort. And based on the scale of this operation, I realized he couldn't afford to pay fair market value for all these properties. He needed to acquire them cheaply through foreclosures, legal challenges, or family disputes that would force owners to sell below market value. My parents weren't just helping him steal my inheritance. They were part of a much larger conspiracy to defraud an entire community of families who'd never see this coming. As I drove home that evening, I spotted the black Mercedes following me at a distance. Kruger had figured out that I was onto his scheme, and now I was probably in more danger than just losing my house. I was threatening to expose a $500 million development project, and people with that much money at stake don't usually let obstacles like me get in their way. The psychiatric evaluation results arrived on a Friday afternoon, delivered by a courier, who made me sign for the thick manila envelope. My hands shook as I opened it, knowing that my entire future depended on what was inside. Dr. Angela Morrison, a forensic psychiatrist from Vanderbilt University Medical Center, had spent 6 weeks reviewing my grandmother's medical records, hospital charts, and prescription history. Her conclusion was unequivocal. Martha Wilson had shown no signs of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or cognitive impairment at any point in the 2 years leading up to her death. Patient demonstrated normal cognitive function during all medical interactions, the report stated. Her responses to questions were appropriate. Her memory was intact, and her ability to make informed decisions was never questioned by any treating physician. Mental status examinations conducted during her final hospitalization showed normal cognition, despite her physical decline. I called Sarah Blackwood immediately, practically shouting the good news into the phone. This proves everything. The fake witnesses were lying, and my grandmother was completely competent when she wrote that real will. This is definitely helpful, Sarah agreed. But we still need the handwriting analysis to prove that your grandmother actually wrote that second will. Grimsby could argue that someone else forged it to match her handwriting. The handwriting analysis was scheduled to be completed the following week, just 3 days before our court date. I spent that time gathering every piece of evidence I could find about Vincent Kruger's development plans and his connection to my parents' lawsuit. I photographed the construction site, researched property records to identify other families who might be targeted, and even managed to get copies of surveyor reports that showed my land was crucial to Kruger's resort design. The marina he planned would be built directly on my 3 acres, making my property worth millions to his development project. On Tuesday evening, I was organizing all this evidence in my living room when I heard vehicles pulling into my driveway. Through the window, I saw 2 sheriff's deputies getting out of a patrol car, followed by Harold Grimsby, and a man I didn't recognize, carrying what looked like an arrest warrant. My stomach dropped as they knocked on my door. Brewster Wilson, you're under arrest for elder abuse, theft, and fraud, one of the deputies announced as he read me my rights. This is ridiculous, I protested. I haven't done anything wrong. Son, we have a signed complaint alleging that you psychologically manipulated an elderly woman into changing her will, the deputy explained. There's also evidence that you stole cash from her home and used it for personal gain. Grimsby stepped forward with his usual slimy smile. An anonymous tipster provided new evidence about your treatment of Martha Wilson in her final months. Security footage from a local bank showing you depositing large amounts of cash immediately after her death, along with witness statements about your aggressive behavior toward your grandmother. I knew this was all fabricated, but arguing with the deputies wouldn't help my situation. They handcuffed me and loaded me into the back of the patrol car, while Grimsby served me with additional court papers. Unfortunately, these new criminal charges mean you'll miss tomorrow's hearing, he said through the car window. The court will have to proceed without your testimony. I spent that night in the county jail, staring at the ceiling and listening to my cellmate snore, while my entire future crumbled. Without me, there to present the evidence about Kruger's conspiracy, Sarah would be fighting an uphill battle against Grimsby's fabricated case. The next morning, a guard brought me a newspaper with a front-page story about the court hearing. Judge Morrison had ruled in favor of my parents, declaring that the cash I'd used to buy my mobile home was rightfully part of my grandmother's estate and should have been distributed equally among her heirs. Due to the defendant's absence and the serious criminal charges pending against him, the article quoted the judge as saying, "This court finds that Brewster Wilson obtained his property through fraudulent means. The mobile home and land will be awarded to the plaintiff, with damages to be determined at a later hearing. I was evicted while still in jail, unable to even collect my personal belongings. Everything I'd worked for over the past 10 years was gone in a single court ruling based on lies and forged evidence." Sarah Blackwood visited me that afternoon with more devastating news. "The criminal charges came from evidence that was obviously planted," she explained. "Bank surveillance footage that was supposedly from the day after your grandmother's death, but the timestamp shows it was actually recorded 3 weeks ago. Witness statements from people who don't exist at real addresses. But by the time we can prove it's all fake, the civil case will be over." "What about the handwriting analysis?" "Grimsby filed a motion to exclude it, as evidence claiming that since you're now facing criminal charges for forgery, any documents in your possession are suspect. The judge agreed to postpone the analysis until after your criminal trial." I hung my head in defeat. Kruger's plan had worked perfectly. He'd managed to get me arrested on fake charges right before the crucial hearing, ensuring that my parents would win by default. Now, they had legal ownership of my property, and he could buy it from them for whatever price they'd agreed to. The bail hearing was set for the following Monday, but even if I could make bail, the damage was already done. My home was gone, my reputation was destroyed, and I was facing potential prison time for crimes I didn't commit. Over the weekend, I learned that local news stations had picked up the story. The coverage portrayed me as a greedy grandson who'd taken advantage of a dying woman's generosity, stealing money that rightfully belonged to his family. My photograph was shown alongside headlines like, "Local man arrested for elder abuse," and "Family fights back against inheritance theft." By the time I made bail on Monday afternoon, using my last $2,000 in savings, my former co-workers at the auto parts store had already been told not to come back. My neighbors avoided making eye contact when I walked past their houses. Even my landlord at the weekly motel where I was forced to stay treated me like a criminal. I'd lost everything: my home, my savings, my reputation, and my faith in the justice system. Vincent Kruger had destroyed my life without ever speaking to me directly, using my own parents as weapons against everything my grandmother had wanted for me. But as I sat in that depressing motel room surrounded by everything I owned in 2 garbage bags, I realized something important. I might have lost the battle, but the war wasn't over yet. Kruger had made one crucial mistake in his elaborate scheme. He'd assumed that breaking me financially and legally would be enough to make me give up and disappear. What he didn't understand was that my grandmother had taught me something more valuable than money. When someone tries to steal what's rightfully yours, you fight back with everything you have. I might not have a house or savings anymore, but I still had the truth. And sometimes that's the most dangerous weapon of all. Living in a weekly rate motel on the outskirts of town wasn't exactly what I'd planned for my life, but it gave me something I hadn't expected: invisibility. Nobody pays attention to the guy washing dishes at the truck stop diner, and that anonymity became my greatest advantage in fighting back against Vincent Kruger's conspiracy. The Sunrise Diner was the kind of place where truckers, construction workers, and shift workers grabbed cheap coffee and greasy food at all hours. I took the dishwashing job because it was the only work I could find with pending criminal charges, and the owner didn't care about background checks as long as you showed up on time and worked hard. My supervisor was a gruff ex-Marine named Roy, who'd lost his left leg in Iraq and walked with a pronounced limp. He didn't ask questions about my situation, but he noticed when I started bringing a notebook to work and scribbling down observations during my breaks. "You writing the great American novel back there, college boy?" he asked one morning as I scrubbed burnt grease from a frying pan. "Something like that." I replied, not ready to trust anyone with the truth about my investigation. But Roy was more observant than I gave him credit for. 3 weeks into my employment, he cornered me during the lunch rush and handed me a cup of coffee. Listen, Brewster, I don't know what kind of trouble you're in, but I recognize a man on a mission when I see one. If you need someone to watch your back, just say the word. That's when I noticed Thomas Wyatt sitting alone in the corner booth, where he'd been having breakfast every morning since I started working there. Roy followed my gaze and nodded. Tom's good people. Retired FBI 25 years investigating white-collar crime. He's been asking about you. Thomas Wyatt looked like a grandfather you'd trust to fix your car and give you life advice. Silver hair, calloused hands, and the kind of steady gaze that suggested he'd seen enough lies to recognize truth when he heard it. When my shift ended that afternoon, he invited me to sit in his booth. Roy tells me you might be dealing with some legal troubles that don't quite add up, he said without preamble. I've been watching you for a few weeks, and you don't strike me as the type who'd abuse an elderly relative. I was desperate enough to trust him, so I told him everything. The forged will, the fake witnesses. Vincent Kruger's development plans, my parents' gambling debts, and the criminal charges that had been filed to keep me away from court. Wyatt listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. This Kruger fellow sounds familiar, he said when I finished. His company was investigated by the Nashville field office a few years back for suspicious land acquisitions, but they could never prove anything concrete. If what you're telling me is true, he's gotten much more sophisticated in his methods. Can you help me prove it? Maybe. But first, we need to gather evidence that would hold up in federal court. Local judges can be influenced or intimidated, but federal prosecutors don't mess around when it comes to conspiracy and fraud. Over the next month, Wyatt taught me surveillance techniques that I never would have learned washing dishes. We started by following Harold Grimsby, who turned out to be remarkably careless about his association with Kruger Development Group. Using Wyatt's old FBI contacts, we discovered that Grimsby was married to Kruger's sister, making him a brother-in-law, rather than an independent attorney. Even more interesting, Grimsby's law practice had received over $200,000 in consulting fees from shell companies owned by Kruger in the past year alone. That's a clear conflict of interest, Wyatt explained as we reviewed bank records he'd obtained through channels I didn't ask about. An attorney can't represent clients in cases where he has a financial interest in the outcome, especially when he fails to disclose that interest to the court. We also discovered that the fake witnesses who'd testified against me were both professional actors from Nashville who specialized in corporate training videos. Linda Foster's real name was Rebecca Martinez, and she'd been paid $5,000 to memorize her testimony about my grandmother's supposed dementia. Marcus Webb was actually David Chen, a struggling actor who'd been promised ongoing work with Kruger's company if he played his role convincingly. But our biggest breakthrough came when Wyatt managed to plant a listening device in Grimsby's law office during a weekend break-in that he assured me was technically legal under certain federal guidelines that I can't explain to civilians. The recording we obtained was devastating. Kruger, Grimsby, and my parents celebrating their victory over drinks and discussing their next targets in the area. My father's voice was clearly audible, bragging about how easy it had been to fool that stupid kid into believing they actually cared about inheritance rights. The Martinez family will be even easier, Kruger's voice said on the recording. Elderly couple, no relatives willing to fight for them. We'll use the same family dispute strategy, maybe claim their grandson has been stealing from them. Patricia's drunken laughter was painful to hear. Poor Brewster still thinks we actually wanted that money for ourselves. He has no idea we're getting a condo in the new resort as payment for helping you get his land. What about the other properties? Grimsby asked. Sullivan's place will require a different approach, Kruger replied. Disabled veteran, very sympathetic case. We'll need to find a way to force him into bankruptcy, maybe arrange for some surprise tax assessments or permit violations. The recording confirmed everything I'd suspected, but it also revealed the scope of Kruger's conspiracy. He wasn't just targeting my property. He was systematically defrauding an entire community of vulnerable families who had no idea what was coming. Wyatt and I spent the next 2 weeks identifying and warning Kruger's other potential victims. George and Helen Martinez were a sweet elderly couple who'd been married for 57 years and lived in a modest farmhouse that had been in Helen's family for 3 generations. Their grandson Jake had recently moved in to help care for them, and Kruger was planning to use that living arrangement to claim elder abuse. Jake Sullivan lived alone in a small cabin on 20 acres of pristine woodland that would be perfect for Kruger's golf course. He'd lost both legs in Afghanistan and survived on disability payments and a small pension. Kruger's plan was to manipulate the county tax assessment office into dramatically increasing the property taxes on Jake's land, forcing him to sell when he couldn't afford the payments. When we explained the conspiracy to these families, their reactions ranged from disbelief to outrage. But they all agreed to work together in fighting back against Kruger's scheme. "This son of a bitch picked the wrong community to mess with," Jake said during our first group meeting at the Martinez family's kitchen table. "We've been through wars, economic depressions, and natural disasters. Some fancy real estate developer from Nashville doesn't scare us." Helen Martinez was even more direct. "My grandfather built this house with his own hands after coming back from World War I. If Vincent Kruger thinks he can steal it with fake lawsuits and crooked lawyers, he's about to learn what happens when you threaten a Tennessee family's land." With Wyatt's guidance, we developed a plan to expose the conspiracy before Kruger could target anyone else. The retired agent used his federal contacts to arrange a meeting with FBI investigators who specialized in organized fraud and public corruption cases. "What you've uncovered here isn't just a real estate scheme," Agent Carol Stevens explained during our meeting in Nashville. "This is racketeering conspiracy to commit fraud, witness tampering, and possibly extortion. If we can prove it, Kruger and his associates are looking at serious federal prison time." The investigation that followed moved faster than I'd expected. Federal agents raided Kruger Development Group's offices, Grimsby's law practice, and even my parents' trailer, seizing computers' financial records, and recorded phone conversations that provided even more evidence of the conspiracy. Within a week, the fake criminal charges against me were dropped when prosecutors realized they were based on fabricated evidence. The bank surveillance footage had been digitally manipulated, the witness statements were fictional, and the anonymous tipster, who'd reported my supposed crimes, was actually Harold Grimsby using a fake name. But the most satisfying moment came when Agent Stevens called to tell me that my parents wanted to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for reduced sentences. "Apparently, they've realized that Kruger never intended to follow through on his promises," she said. "The condo he offered them as payment doesn't exist, and the contracts they signed aren't worth the paper they're printed on. They're scared broke and looking for a way to avoid federal prison." I agreed to meet with my parents for the first time since this nightmare began, not because I forgave them, but because I wanted to look them in the eye and hear them admit what they'd done to their own family. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the federal building in Nashville, with Agent Stevens and 2 federal prosecutors present as witnesses. My parents looked older than I remembered, their faces drawn with the stress of facing potential federal prison sentences. Patricia was crying, before anyone said a word, mascara running down her cheeks, as she twisted a tissue between her fingers. Dale couldn't meet my eyes, staring instead at the table, while Agent Stevens explained the terms of their potential cooperation agreement. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, your son has agreed to this meeting, so you can explain your involvement in Vincent Kruger's conspiracy," Stevens said. "This is your opportunity to provide truthful testimony about how you were recruited and what role you played in the fraudulent lawsuit against Brewster's property." My mother spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "We never meant for it to go this far, Brewster. When Vincent first approached us, he said it would just be a simple civil suit to get you to sell the land. He promised we'd get enough money to pay off our debts and start over somewhere else." "How much were you in debt?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Dale finally looked up. 68,000 to the casino. Another 35,000 in credit card advances your mother used for gambling. The loan sharks were threatening to break my legs if we didn't pay up. So you decided to steal my house instead. It wasn't supposed to be stealing, Patricia protested. Vincent said the land was worth so much for his development that there'd be plenty of money for everyone. He promised you'd get a fair settlement once the legal issues were resolved. Federal prosecutor James Mitchell leaned forward. Tell us about the forged will and the fake witnesses. Dale's story came out in pieces, each revelation more damaging than the last. Kruger had provided them with a template of my grandmother's signature, copied from old Christmas cards they'd saved. Harold Grimsby had prepared the fake will and coached them on what to say in court. The witnesses were recruited through a talent agency that specialized in corporate training videos. Vincent said this was completely legal, Dale insisted. He called it aggressive real estate acquisition strategies and claimed that big developers did this kind of thing all the time. What about the criminal charges filed against Brewster? Agent Stevens asked. That wasn't part of the original plan, Patricia admitted. When you found that handwritten will in your grandmother's Bible, Vincent panicked. He said we needed to buy more time for the civil case to go through, so he had Harold arrange those fake criminal charges. The federal prosecutors exchanged glances before Mitchell continued. We need you to explain Vincent Kruger's plans for the other families in the area. This was when I learned the full scope of Kruger's conspiracy. According to my parents, he'd been planning this development for over 3 years, systematically researching property owners around Center Hill Lake and identifying vulnerabilities he could exploit. The Martinez family was targeted because their grandson Jake had a minor criminal record from 20 years ago that Kruger planned to use against them. Jake Sullivan's disability made him sympathetic in court, but Kruger had discovered old medical records suggesting he'd struggled with depression and planned to claim he was mentally incompetent to manage his finances. There were at least 12 other families on his list, Dale said. Vincent had files on all of them. Financial problems, family disputes, health issues, anything he could use to force them off their land. Even more disturbing was Kruger's relationship with local officials. He'd been making campaign contributions to County Commissioner Brad Thompson and Tax Assessor Linda Hayes, ensuring their cooperation when he needed property assessments manipulated or building permits fast-tracked. How much money was Vincent expecting to make from this development? Mitchell asked. He told us the resort would generate over $1 billion in revenue once it was fully operational, Patricia said. The initial investment was $500 million, but he expected to triple that within 10 years. With this kind of money at stake, it was no wonder Kruger had been willing to orchestrate such an elaborate conspiracy. Stealing a dozen properties worth a total of maybe $2 million was a small price to pay for a billion-dollar resort empire. The prosecutors spent another hour going over details documenting every aspect of the conspiracy that my parents could remember. By the time we finished, they had enough evidence to charge Kruger Grimsby and their associates with multiple federal crimes. As my parents prepared to leave, Dale turned to me with tears in his eyes. Brewster, I know there's no excuse for what we did. We were desperate and scared, but that doesn't make it right. Your grandmother would be ashamed of us for betraying everything she taught our family. She'd be disappointed. I agreed. But she'd also want us to make things right. That's why I'm testifying against Kruger, even though it means reliving this whole nightmare in court. Patricia reached out like she wanted to hug me, then thought better of it. We're going to spend whatever time we have left trying to make amends for this. We know we can't undo the damage, but maybe we can prevent Vincent from hurting other families the way he hurt ours. After they left, Agent Stevens walked me to the elevator. Your parents are looking at 18 to 36 months in federal prison, depending on how helpful their testimony proves to be. Grimsby and Kruger are facing much more serious charges: conspiracy, racketeering, fraud, witness tampering. We're talking about 10 to 20 years if they're convicted on all counts. What about my house? That's more complicated. The civil court ruling was based on fraudulent evidence, so it should be overturned once we prove the conspiracy. But it might take several months for the paperwork to go through all the proper channels. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, thinking about everything that had happened since that first day when my parents showed up with Harold Grimsby. 6 months ago, I'd been living peacefully in my dream home, working at the auto parts store, and planning a small vegetable garden. Now I was washing dishes at a truck stop diner and preparing to testify in a federal criminal case against a multi-million-dollar real estate conspiracy. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I'd almost forgotten hope. The federal investigation moved quickly once my parents started cooperating. Within 2 weeks, FBI agents had arrested Vincent Kruger at his Nashville office, charging him with conspiracy to commit fraud, racketeering witness, tampering, and money laundering. Harold Grimsby was arrested the same day and disbarred immediately. The local news coverage was dramatically different this time. Instead of portraying me as a greedy grandson who'd abused his elderly grandmother, reporters described me as a whistleblower who'd exposed a major real estate fraud conspiracy that could have affected dozens of families. The Nashville Business Journal ran a front-page story about Kruger's arrest with the headline, "Developer Accused of Massive Land Grab Scheme." The article detailed how his company had used fake lawsuits, forged documents, and bribed officials to steal property from vulnerable families across Middle Tennessee. Even more satisfying was the response from my community. Jake Sullivan organized a legal defense fund to help cover my attorney fees, and the Martinez family started a petition demanding that all of Kruger's previous real estate acquisitions be investigated for fraud. "This man tried to steal our entire way of life," Helen Martinez told a television reporter. "If it weren't for Brewster's courage in fighting back, Vincent Kruger would have succeeded in destroying our community." The federal trial was scheduled for the following spring, giving prosecutors time to build an airtight case against Kruger and his associates. In the meantime, Agent Stevens assured me that steps were being taken to restore my legal ownership of the mobile home and property. "Judge Morrison has agreed to vacate his previous ruling once he reviews the evidence of fraud in your case," she explained. "He's embarrassed that his court was used as part of this conspiracy, and he wants to make sure you're fully compensated for what you've been through." As winter turned to spring, I found myself in the strange position of being a local celebrity. People recognized me at the grocery store and wanted to shake my hand for standing up to corporate bullying. The auto parts store offered me my old job back with a raise and an apology for doubting my character. But the best news came on a sunny April morning, when Sarah Blackwood called to tell me the civil court had officially restored my ownership of the house and land, along with damages for the emotional distress I'd suffered. "You can move back home anytime you want," she said. "The property is yours free and clear, just like your grandmother intended." I drove out to my 3 acres that afternoon and sat on the deck where this whole nightmare had started 9 months earlier. The lake was calm, reflecting the blue sky and white clouds like a mirror. My vegetable garden had grown wild in my absence, but the tomato plants I'd started the previous spring had somehow survived the winter and were already sprouting new growth. Everything looked exactly the same, but I felt like a completely different person. I'd learned things about myself that I never would have discovered living peacefully in my mobile home, that I was stronger than I realized, that fighting for what's right is more important than avoiding conflict, and that sometimes the greatest victories come from helping others rather than protecting yourself. The federal prosecutors had told me that my willingness to investigate and expose Kruger's conspiracy had probably saved at least a dozen other families from losing their homes. That knowledge meant more to me than getting my own property back. As I sat there, watching the sunset over the water, I thought about my grandmother's words from that hospital bed 10 years ago. Build yourself a real home, something permanent that nobody can ever take away from you. She'd been talking about more than just a house. She'd been talking about the kind of life where you stand up for what's right, protect the people you care about, and never let anyone steal your integrity. That was the real inheritance she'd left me. and it was worth more than any amount of money. The federal trial began on a crisp Monday morning in October, almost exactly 1 year after my grandmother had died, and left me the inheritance that started this whole ordeal. The courthouse in Nashville was packed with reporters, community members, and families that Kruger had targeted in his conspiracy. Vincent Kruger looked nothing like the confident businessman who'd met with my parents in their trailer a year ago. Federal prison had been hard on him. He'd lost weight, his expensive suits had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit, and his arrogant demeanor had given way to the nervous energy of someone facing serious consequences for his actions. Harold Grimsby sat at a separate defense table, having been abandoned by his former brother-in-law, when federal investigators discovered additional evidence of fraud in their other business dealings. The forensic accountants had traced over $3 million in illegal payments made to various accomplices in Kruger's land acquisition scheme. Federal prosecutor James Mitchell delivered an opening statement that laid out the entire conspiracy in devastating detail. Using charts, photographs, and recordings, he showed how Kruger had systematically targeted vulnerable families across Middle Tennessee, using fake lawsuits, forged documents, and bribed officials to steal their property for a fraction of its true value. This wasn't a business strategy, Mitchell told the jury. This was organized crime disguised as real estate development. Vincent Kruger and his associates conspired to defraud honest families out of their homes, their heritage, and their future. The prosecution's case was built on the evidence we'd gathered over the past year. Agent Stevens testified about the FBI investigation, playing recordings of Kruger discussing his plans to target other families in the area. The handwriting expert confirmed that my grandmother's will had been forged using signature samples obtained through theft and fraud. Most powerful was the testimony from Kruger's victims. Jake Sullivan described how tax assessors working for Kruger had tried to artificially inflate his property taxes to force him into bankruptcy. George and Helen Martinez explained how their grandson had been falsely accused of elder abuse as part of a scheme to steal their family farm. When it was my turn to testify, I walked the jury through the entire timeline of Kruger's conspiracy against my family. I described my grandmother's deathbed promise, the 10 years of saving for my dream home, and the devastating betrayal when my own parents joined forces with a corrupt developer to steal everything I'd worked for. I didn't just lose my house, I told the jury. I lost my faith in my family, my trust in the legal system, and my belief that hard work and honesty were enough to protect what you'd earned. Vincent Kruger didn't just steal property. He stole people's sense of security and justice. The defense attorneys tried to portray their clients as ambitious businessmen who'd made poor decisions but hadn't intended to commit serious crimes. They argued that real estate development always involved aggressive tactics and that the families who'd lost their property had been fairly compensated through legal proceedings. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, racketeering witness, tampering, money laundering, and multiple counts of mail and wire fraud. Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Vincent Kruger to 18 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay over $12 million in restitution to his victims. Harold Grimsby received 8 years and was permanently disbarred from practicing law anywhere in the United States. My parents were sentenced to 2 years each in minimum security facilities, with credit for time served and good behavior. They'd also agreed to testify in additional cases against Kruger's other accomplices, including the county officials who'd accepted bribes to manipulate property assessments and building permits. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse, feeling like I could finally put this chapter of my life behind me. Agent Stevens caught up with me on the courthouse steps, where reporters were waiting to ask questions about the case. "How does it feel to get justice after everything you've been through?" one reporter asked. I thought about that question for a moment before answering. Justice isn't just about punishing people who do wrong things. It's about making sure their victims can rebuild their lives and preventing others from suffering the same kind of harm. The restitution money from Kruger's conviction allowed me to make significant improvements to my property. I added a workshop where I could work on restoring vintage cars, expanded the vegetable garden that had somehow survived my year of homelessness, and built a guest cabin for family members who wanted to visit. More importantly, I used part of the settlement money to establish the Martha Wilson Foundation, a non-profit organization that provides legal assistance to elderly and vulnerable families facing suspicious real estate disputes. Thomas Wyatt agreed to serve as the foundation's director, using his FBI experience to investigate potential fraud cases before they could devastate other families. Jake Sullivan became one of our first success stories. Using techniques we'd learned during our fight against Kruger, we helped him expose a similar conspiracy, targeting disabled veterans across Tennessee. The perpetrators were prosecuted by the same federal team that had handled our case, and Jake recovered not only his property, but damages that allowed him to start his own nonprofit, helping other veterans avoid predatory real estate schemes. The Martinez family donated land for a community center, where we could hold educational workshops about property rights, estate planning, and how to recognize the warning signs of real estate fraud. Helen Martinez, despite being in her 70s, became our most effective advocate traveling across Tennessee to speak with other elderly families about protecting themselves from scammers. But the most unexpected development came from my relationship with Sarah Blackwood, the attorney who'd represented me during the darkest period of this ordeal. What had started as a professional relationship during my legal troubles had gradually evolved into something deeper as we worked together on the Foundation's cases. Sarah understood better than anyone what this experience had cost me, not just financially, but emotionally. She'd seen me at my lowest point when I was washing dishes at a truck stop and living in a weekly motel, convinced that I'd lost everything my grandmother had wanted for me. She'd also seen me find the strength to fight back against impossible odds and turn my personal tragedy into a way of helping others. We were married on a perfect spring day at my grandmother's old farmhouse, with Jake Sullivan serving as my best man and Helen Martinez walking Sarah down the aisle in place of her late father. Thomas Wyatt officiated the ceremony, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. My parents were there, having been released from federal prison 6 months earlier. The experience had changed them in ways I wouldn't have thought possible. Dale had completed a gambling addiction treatment program and found work as a mechanic at an honest shop that didn't ask questions about his criminal record. Patricia had started volunteering at a senior center, helping other families navigate Medicare and Social Security paperwork. Their apology wasn't just words anymore. It was demonstrated through their actions and their commitment to making amends for the damage they'd caused. We'd never have the same relationship we'd had before this ordeal, but we'd found a way to be family again, built on honesty rather than blind trust. During our wedding reception, I stood up to thank everyone who'd helped me through the past 2 years. Looking out at the faces of people who'd supported me when everything seemed hopeless, I realized that my grandmother's dying wish had come true in ways she never could have imagined. She'd wanted me to build a permanent home that nobody could ever take away from me. The house and land were certainly part of that, but the real foundation was the community of people who'd stood with me against injustice and corruption. That was something that no amount of money could buy, and no conspiracy could destroy. My grandmother used to say that real family means protecting each other, not taking advantage, I told the wedding guests. She also taught me that when someone tries to steal what's rightfully yours, you fight back with everything you have. But the most important lesson she left me was that the greatest victories aren't the ones you win for yourself. They're the ones that help other people win their own battles. As Sarah and I danced to our first song as husband and wife, I looked out over the lake, where I'd once sat feeling completely defeated and alone. The same water reflected the lights from our reception, but instead of isolation, I saw celebration. Instead of despair, I saw hope. Instead of endings, I saw new beginnings. The Martha Wilson Foundation has now helped over 200 families protect their property rights and fight back against various forms of real estate fraud. Thomas Wyatt has trained a network of volunteer investigators across Tennessee who can recognize the warning signs of predatory development schemes. Jake Sullivan's Veteran Advocacy Program has prevented countless disabled veterans from losing their homes to unscrupulous scammers. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome has been watching my parents rebuild their relationship with our extended family. The shame of their involvement in Kruger's conspiracy had initially made them want to hide from everyone they'd wronged. Instead, they chose the harder path of making direct amends, helping other families avoid the mistakes that had led them to betray their own son. 3 years after Vincent Kruger's conviction, I received a letter from him in federal prison. It was a rambling attempt at an apology, claiming that he'd never intended for his business practices to hurt innocent families. He asked for my forgiveness and suggested that he'd learned valuable lessons about the difference between aggressive business tactics and outright fraud. I never responded to that letter. Some actions are too fundamental a betrayal of human decency to be forgiven with words. Kruger had deliberately targeted vulnerable families, using their trust and their love for each other as weapons against them. That wasn't a business mistake. It was a calculated decision to profit from other people's suffering. But I also didn't throw the letter away. I kept it as a reminder that redemption is possible for anyone willing to do the hard work of change, even if forgiveness isn't guaranteed. My parents had proven that people could transform themselves through genuine accountability and sustained effort to repair the damage they'd caused. Every morning, I still sit on my deck with coffee watching the sun rise over the lake, just like I did during those first 3 perfect months before this whole ordeal began. But now, Sarah joins me, and we talk about the families we're helping through the foundation, the progress Jake and the Martinez family are making with their own advocacy work, and our plans for the future. We're expecting our first child in the spring, and I find myself thinking about what kind of world we want to leave for the next generation. My grandmother's inheritance wasn't just money or property. It was the values that had guided her through 9 decades of life. Values like standing up for what's right, protecting people who can't protect themselves, and never letting greed or fear compromise your integrity. Those are the gifts I want to pass on to my children, not just a comfortable home and financial security, but the strength to fight injustice wherever they find it, and the wisdom to know that real wealth comes from the relationships you build, and the positive impact you have on other people's lives. Vincent Kruger thought he could steal my inheritance, but he never understood what my grandmother had really left me. He could forge documents, bribe officials, and even turn my own parents against me, but he couldn't touch the most valuable part of her legacy, the knowledge that when you stand up for what's right, you're never truly alone. Sometimes people ask me if I ever regret fighting back, instead of just accepting Kruger's offer and moving on with my life. The answer is simple. Everything good that came out of this experience happened because I refused to let him win. The foundation, the community we built my marriage to Sarah, the relationship I rebuilt with my parents, the hundreds of families we've helped, none of that would have existed if I'd given up when the fight seemed hopeless. My grandmother used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding that something else is more important than being afraid. I finally understand what she meant. Fighting for justice isn't about being fearless. It's about caring so much about protecting what's right that you're willing to face your fears to do it. That's the real lesson of this story. When someone tries to steal your dreams, your heritage, or your sense of justice, you don't have to accept it. You can fight back. You can win. And in winning, you can help other people win their own battles too. The lake is calm this morning, reflecting the blue sky like a mirror. Sarah is beside me, reading case files from families who've asked for our help. In a few hours, we'll drive to the community center for another workshop on property rights, where Jake and Helen will share their expertise with families who want to protect themselves from predators. It's a good life, built on the foundation my grandmother envisioned, but shaped by everything we've learned about the power of community, the importance of justice, and the possibility of redemption for anyone willing to do the work. And that's something nobody can ever take away from us. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to stand up against someone trying to take advantage of your family or community? What gave you the strength to fight back when the odds seemed impossible? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone else who's facing their own David and Goliath situation. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to help others find it. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when they needed it most. And please share this with anyone who might need a reminder that justice is possible when good people refuse to stay silent. Thank you for taking this journey with me. And remember, no matter how powerful the forces against you might seem, the truth has a way of winning in the end. Sometimes, it just takes longer than we'd like and requires more courage than we knew we had. But it's always worth the fight. Keep standing up for what's right, and never let anyone convince you that justice is only for people with money and influence. It belongs to all of us, and sometimes the most important victories come from the most unlikely heroes. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.